The history of the Byzantine Empire is often overshadowed by the Western Roman Empire. Yet among the small but illustrious order of truly notable Byzantine rulers, alongside such great figures as Justinian, Constantine and Heraclius, stands possibly the greatest ruler of the medieval age, Basil II. Welcome to our video on the eventful life and magnificent deeds of Basil II, how he came to the throne of Constantinople, how the empire was governed under his reign, and how this emperor eventually came to be known by the moniker for which he would be famous forever after, Bulgarslayer, the Bulgarslayer. Thanks to Blood of Steel for sponsoring this video. Blood of Steel is a new massively multiplayer online action strategy game on PC, and it's free to play. In Blood of Steel, you pick one of hundreds of historical leaders and their elite units to fight in massive battles, pitting thousands of fighters against each other. You'll fight as one of the generals in exciting action, but you'll also be able to command the unit under them, which brings a strategy element. Just look at this roster of heroes. Blood of Steel has hundreds of ancient and medieval leaders, among them Crusaders and Vikings, and Three Kingdoms era generals, divided into three classes, including Caesar, Alexander, Richard Lionheart, Joan of Arc, Leonidas, Harold Hardrada, Han Xin, Edward I, Lu Bu, and Baldwin IV. Conquer cities, expand your empire. In Blood of Steel, you'll not be alone. Join a legion war with your friends, siege a castle, or become kings of the hill. Let your guild be the most powerful league on the Steel land. Blood of Steel prides itself on not being pay to win, as you can only buy skins and effects. Support our channel and dive into the historical battles by clicking our special link in the description to download the game for free. Basil II was son of Emperor Romanos II and his intelligent but low-born empress Theophano in 958. At this time, the emperors of Constantinople's century-old dynasty, called Macedonian due to the birthplace of its founder Basil I, intermittently lacked any real authority, although their line remained unbroken. Basil's grandfather Constantine VII was a puppet twice during his long reign, first subordinated to his mother and then to a usurping magnate, while the reign of Romanos himself had been a prosperous one, but it seems to have been despite the emperor, as his father preferred luxury and excess to military campaigns and administration. However, Romanos II unexpectedly died when Basil was just 5, leaving the imperial dynasty in a precarious position. This dangerous situation was solved swiftly when Byzantium's greatest general, Nikephoros Phokas, assumed the role of co-emperor and married Theophano, swearing to protect and uphold the rights of Basil and his brother Constantine, becoming, as historian Anthony Kaldelis phrased it, a guardian general. In his 6-year-long rule, the man who would become known as the Pale Death of the Saracens waged constant warfare, reconquering Cilicia, Cyprus and Antioch, as well as paving the way for possible future campaigns in Syria and Mesopotamia as the Abbasid Caliphate disintegrated. However, the strain on Byzantium's population and Nikephoros' failure as a politician led to his murder and deposition by John Tzimiskes in 969. Just like his predecessor, Tzimiskes, another guardian general, also guaranteed the inheritance of Theophano's children. During his 8-year-long reign, he managed to subdue Bulgaria and defeated the Rus armies of Sviatoslav. In 976 though, Tzimiskes died upon returning from a grand tour of the empire, leaving an 18-year-old Basil II basileus of an empire nearing the zenith of its medieval power. Due to the young ruler's inexperience, real governmental authority was exercised by courtier Basil Lakapenos. This vizier-like character reshuffled military appointments throughout the empire following Tzimiskes' death, stirring up a hornet's nest. Domestikos of the East Bardas Skleros, a general from an influential family, was demoted, but unwilling to take such a slap in the face, Skleros proclaimed himself emperor in summer 976. This initiated a civil war in Anatolia, which initially went well for the rebel forces, prompting Lakapenos to desperately recall one of Skleros' rivals, chief of perhaps the greatest of noble families, Bardas Phokas. After being appointed Domestikos, he lured Skleros into northeastern Anatolia and defeated him in 979, after which the usurper fled to Baghdad. By 985, Basil desired political independence and dismissed Lakapenos. Then a year later, believing military accolades of his own would nullify Phocas' power, the emperor embarked on a campaign against the Bulgarian Empire, ruled by a member of the Komitopuli dynasty, Samuel, the first of his dynasty to do so. On his way home from the unsuccessful venture, however, Basil's army was ambushed and destroyed at Trajan's Gate, and he barely escaped alive. Once word of this catastrophe reverberated east, Skleros returned and revived his rebellion in 987. He was joined soon after by Phokas, who also claimed the throne for himself. The two made an alliance, but the latter quickly betrayed the former and had him jailed. As Basil had little power in Asia Minor at the time, Phocas' armies were soon able to reach Abydos on the Hellespont. His situation seemed dire, but Basil II had one key advantage. Bardas Phokas was a powerful figure, but tactically and strategically he was thoroughly incompetent. In a now immortal diplomatic dice roll, Basil II married off his sister Anna to Vladimir, Grand Prince of the newly Christianized Rus, in return for 6,000 of his ferocious Varangian mercenaries, who would be loyal only to the Byzantine Emperor. Their impact on Basil's reign was felt immediately. With the exotic, lethal force of Northmen at his side, the emperor crossed the Hellespont and locked horns with one of Phocas' subordinates at Chrysopolis in late 988. The rebel army was destroyed, its leader captured and executed. Early in 989, Basil boldly marched to Abydos and confronted the arch-traitor Bardas Phokas, who was also defeated and killed. The emperor had Phocas' head paraded around the empire as a grisly threat, terrifying his remaining supporters into surrender and leaving Basil the undisputed master of the empire. In the immediate aftermath, Basil enacted policies designed to moderate the unruly aristocracy. The emperor's own rhetoric depicts his struggle with powerful nobles in this period as a pro-peasant crusade, with himself as the champion of the serfs, but it is more likely that the actual goal was to increase Basil's own power. Perhaps the strictest of these measures was the Allelengion, or mutual security tax, which required the empire's oligarchy to meet any financial shortfall for peasants who were too destitute to pay up themselves, and those who died in war. This brought Basil II great favour among the peasantry, but irritated the nobles. The emperor also refused to appoint another Domestikos of the East, the high military posting which frequently served as a stepping stone to the throne. Other political tactics included increasing the authority of imperial bureaucrats, confiscating property, and most importantly, keeping his loyal Varangian enforcers close by. Historical narratives generally focus on dramatic events, and so the notable scarcity of our sources for Basil's reign after the Skleros-Phokas revolts indicate that his domestic program was working. According to Anthony Kaldelis, the darkness that envelops Constantinople probably means that for some 50 years there were few famines, unpopular appointments, vexatious taxes, or abuses by soldiers. When viewed like this, Basil II appears at first glance to be an early medieval equivalent of Antoninus Pius, a wise emperor whose policies mitigated the kind of chaos which chroniclers love to write about. The image of Basil as a pacifistic emperor is spoiled completely, however, when his frequent bloody frontier wars are taken into account, comprising some of the most famous conflicts in all Byzantine history. Unfortunately for us, the information we possess on Basil's military activity following the Magnate revolts is very poor. A general theme we can nevertheless observe is a rebalancing of the empire's martial focus from the eastern frontier, where the great Byzantine generals of the 10th century achieved considerable success against failing Muslim states, to Bulgaria. Having learned tough lessons at Trajan's Gate and during his civil wars, Basil took the field again in 991 against the twin Bulgarian rulers Samuil and Roman, aiming to retake imperial lands which had been lost after the disasters of 986. This time, however, the Basileus focused on raising forces of quality rather than quantity. Only the best themed troops, an expanded Tagmata professional force, and of course the vaunted Varangians marched with him. For 4 consecutive years, Basil II methodically bulldozed his way around Macedonia and Thrace, capturing or destroying many Bulgarian citadels, defeating Samuil in battle, and even taking Tsar Roman prisoner. To make the campaign easier, Basil employed typically sharp Byzantine diplomacy to encircle his foe, drawing up alliances with Serbian Dukia and Croatia. Meanwhile, the situation on Byzantium's eastern frontier in Syria was deteriorating. Since hostilities with the Fatimid Caliphate resumed in 990, Dux of Antioch Michael Bourtzes had been repeatedly thrashed and the empire's satellite state of Aleppo besieged. After receiving an appeal from the latter whilst campaigning in Bulgaria, Basil departed with his main army and went east in early 995. To ensure the march was as efficient as possible, the Basileus mounted his infantry on mules so that the entire army could travel more swiftly. Because of this, it took only a month to move from Bulgaria to Antioch. This goes a long way to show the type of commander Basil II was, a strategist, logistician, and micromanager who, while not a flashy battlefield tactician, scoured the Byzantine military manuals and used that knowledge to bring home the victories. Not wasting a moment, Basil beelined straight for Aleppo and forced the Fatimid siege army into a panicked retreat. After then receiving the homage for giving the debts of his Muslim clients, the emperor captured Apamea and several other cities in the region. At one point his forces were raided by local tribesmen, and Basil wasn't going to put up with it. Capturing 40 of them, he had the nomads' hands cut off and then released them. No more attacks are recorded. Choosing to remain in Syria until the area was stable, the emperor fought more battles against the Fatimids and inserted himself diplomatically into the caliphate's disintegrating political situation. To earn its goodwill, Basil refused to support a revolt against Cairo in 997, but then pivoted and cynically supported Tyre's insurrection a year later because it severed Fatimid supply lines. At the turn of the new millennium, with the East pacified, Basil II signed a decade-long peace with Cairo, integrated part of Georgia, and then turned his gaze back to the west. To ensure tranquility remained on the Fatimid border, the Basileus' trusted subordinate Nikephoros Ouranos, who had recently beaten Samuil's army in Basil's absence, was left there as dux. Making his way up the Via Militaris, the emperor established his base of operations at Philippopolis before turning north, taking Sredets and a number of peripheral fortresses despite gritty resistance. With the Sofia basin thereby secured, Samuil's domains were cut in two, leaving each segment more vulnerable. Then in 1001, Basil embarked on a campaign to recapture Byzantine possessions in Greece and Macedonia, capturing Beroea, Kolydros, Servia, most of Thessaly, and a hilltop fortress known as Vodin. The next year, war continued, with Byzantine forces invading the Middle Danube in an attempt to confine Tsar Samuil, who had inherited the title after Roman's death at Constantinople, in an imperial pincer. Basil invested the region's primary fortress of Vidin. As his countermove, the Bulgarian ruler circled around and sacked Adrianople as a distraction, hoping the emperor would withdraw to deal with him. Unwilling to be peeled away from his strategic objective, however, Basil safely ignored Samuil's feint and saw out the 8-month siege, which ended in success during December 1002. With Vidin's fall, Bulgaria's heartland was virtually encircled by Roman bases. In 1003, after wintering in the captured city, the emperors Tagmata and Varangian warriors took Nisus before bearing down on Skopje. There they encountered Samuil's relief force opposite them over the Vardar River. The Tsar encamped on the south side, trusting in the watercourse's depth to protect his camp. Unfortunately for him, the Byzantine emperor discovered a fordable section, crossed the Vardar at night, and descended on the Bulgarian camp, forcing Samuil into rout. It would be gratuitous to include every one of Basil's victories, but all of these triumphs led to a military status quo summarized by our main source, John Skylitzes. Samuil could do nothing in open country, nor could he oppose the emperor in formal battle. He was shattered on all fronts and his forces were declining. The weakening of Bulgarian forces meant that they could no longer go toe-to-toe with the clinical Byzantines. Nevertheless, Skylitzes tells us that the emperor continued to invade Bulgaria every year without interruption, laying waste to everything that came to hand. So it is inferred that Samuil either fought a guerrilla war of back-and-forth raids during the narratively dark years leading up to 1014, or concluded some kind of temporary peace. The conflict ramped up again in 1014 for reasons that are not entirely clear. In his acclaimed book on the wars between Byzantium and Bulgaria, Denis Hupchik hypothesizes that a peace agreement made in 1004 or 1005 simply expired, since Byzantine peace deals usually lasted for a decade as a matter of course. Alternatively, it may have been Basil II's tolerance for Samuil's constant irregular fighting that expired. Whatever the real cause may or may not have been, we do know that in 1014, Basil's main army, perhaps 23,000 strong, struck Bulgarian frontier positions in the lower Struma Valley northeast of Thessaloniki, one of the empire's great cities. From his base at Komotini, the emperor marched north along the Struma River until he reached the valley carved out by one of its westward leading tributaries. Basil pivoted and advanced into this low area between two large mountain ranges, which the Byzantines dubbed Kimbalonga, or Long Plain, until it narrowed midway through. At the valley's most enclosed point, known as Kulic, or more notoriously Kladon, Little Key, the imperial forces discovered Samuil's revitalized Bulgarians blocking their path, heavily fortified behind formidable earthworks. With little other option than to test the enemy defences, Basil II launched a series of frontal attacks against the Bulgarians, which Skylitzes describes. The Byzantine soldiers attempted to force a way in, but the guards stoutly resisted, killing the assailants and wounding them by hurling weapons from up above. Applying Herodotus's immortal tale of Thermopylae, Basil dispatched Xiphias to outflank the Bulgarians via a Belasitsa mountain pass, while he attacked from the front, leading to a complete imperial victory and many prisoners taken. Bulgaroktonos supposedly had 15,000 captive Bulgarians blinded, leaving only 1 in 100 men with a single eye to lead their comrades home. When these unfortunate souls filed back into Samuil's capital weeks later, the Tsar supposedly suffered a seizure and died. Following the Tsar's defeat, his realm succumbed to dynastic strife and weakened even further, allowing Basil II to mop up the last embers of resistance. Finally, when one of the last Bulgarian claimants, Ivan Vladislav, was killed outside Dyrrachium in 1018, the remainder of Bulgaria's royalty and Bolyari leadership realized there was no prospect of victory and surrendered. ending a Bulgarian empire which had troubled Eastern Rome for over 3 centuries. Basil toured his newly conquered territories, setting up administrative structures, accepting surrenders and acclamations, before going to Athens and giving thanks to God at the Parthenon, now functioning as a church. Then he returned to Constantinople and celebrated a triumph, parading himself, all of the sea's treasure, and his Komitopuli clan captives, particularly the Tsarina Maria, through the city as a victorious general. Although the moniker Bulgarslayer might give the impression that Basil II disliked Bulgarians in particular, he actually treated his recently acquired subjects and their former Boyari lords with considerable tact, generosity, and lenience. In fact, he dealt with this problem of integration so well that Bulgaria would be under Byzantine rule for almost 2 centuries. The remnant of Bulgaria's leadership was seamlessly inserted into the empire's social structure, showered with prestigious imperial ranks and titles, and granted rich donatives, as well as land of their own to rule, if they pledged fealty to Basil. Surviving members of the Bulgarian Komitopuli house were made patricians and given land in Anatolia, both physically removing them from the Balkan realm they once ruled, and tying their fate to Constantinople. In perennially sensitive matters of religion, the emperor proved himself light-handed by confirming the Bulgarian church's autonomy from the Byzantine church, but intelligently refused to recognize its leader as equal in status to the patriarch in Constantinople. Meanwhile, commoners' day-to-day lives in the conquered regions were not heavily disrupted, as Basil retained the previous tax system, the only change being which treasury their wealth ended up in. As Yahya of Antioch optimistically concluded, in uniting one with the other, he brought to an end the ancient animosity that had existed between them. With Byzantine authority established throughout most of the Balkan Peninsula, Basil went off to campaign in Georgia during the early 1020s. However, despite the apparent glory of the age, a rebellion erupted in Cappadocia during 1022, led by the hero of Claydon, Xiphias, and Nikephoros Phokas, Bardas' son. Unfortunately for the would-be usurpers, a lightning-fast imperial response led Xiphias to murder his magnate colleague in panic. Neither this act of double betrayal or his role at Claydon saved him. According to one account, Xiphias was viciously tortured to death upon being captured by Basil's agents and hurried back to the capital. Yet another example of the Bulgarslayer's fearsome deterrence tactics. Basil II passed away in December 1025 at 67 years old, his reign having been a long revolt sandwich with a sweet filling of stunning military success and relative domestic bliss. His younger brother and successor, Constantine VIII, who had lived irrelevantly in Basil's shadow for over half a century, buried his dead sibling at the military mustering point at Hebdomon instead of the imperial mausoleum, as was his wish. The lengthy epitaph of Basil II's tomb survives to this day and provides a beautiful glimpse into how he wished to be remembered. From the day when the King of Heaven called upon me to become emperor, the great overlord of the world, no one saw my spear lie idle. Although Basil the Bulgarslayer would later be remembered as one of the greatest rulers in Byzantine history, his successes would not long outlive him. Increasing imperial mismanagement, terrible civil strife, and the presence of ferocious new enemies would eventually, less than half a century after its greatest triumph, lead to its greatest failure at Manzikert in 1071. We will talk about Roman and Byzantine history more in the coming months, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.